Alright, what's going on everybody? It's me again, Stevie Stroh, and hopefully you're not sick and tired of seeing my big fat ugly face at this point with all these videos, but I've just come up with another wild harebrained schemed idea on how I can have my real Coco with my CoCoSDC and an SD card inserted, configure that SD card to automatically boot into a DriveWire based disk. And so since I had just learned DriveWire and I was having to boot to the OK prompt and mount disks for me as part of the learning process, that's great. But what if I want to start using DriveWire on a yearly basis? What if I want DriveWire to be how I operate? I came up with a program to help me do that, and that program is on the screen right now. And so what I am going to assume you know how to do is to create the startup config file on the root of your SD card. That is something that needs to be done for the CoCoSDC to auto boot. If you're using the CoCoSDC Explorer, you're already doing that. So on my current SD card, I have a disk that I call AUTOEXEC.DSK. My startup config says mount drive 0 to AUTOEXEC.DSK. That disk is mounted, and then in the root of that disk I have created this program here that's called AUTOEXEC.BAS, which is a basic program. And so the way the CoCoSDC works is if you have your startup config file mounting a disk, and that disk happens to have an AUTOEXEC.BAS file, that disk will auto mount and that program will auto run, and that's how the SDC Explorer boots up for us magically. So what I've done is I've taken that same principle now and I've made a single purpose disk in a single purpose AUTOEXEC.BAS file that in lines 0 through 3 it unmounts all of the drives. And so I'm turning off all of the virtual drives in the CoCoSDC. And then in line 4 I am mounting DriveWire to drive 0, because your Coco wants to work and live in drive 0 by default. So I went ahead and said mount drive 0 to DriveWire slot 0. I went ahead and I printed a little message on there that says what I did, just so it looks informative and it looks official. I am then listing the contents of that disk, and then I've even added a provision where if once I mount that disk, if that disk has its own AUTOEXEC.BAS file, I can literally auto boot to that disk that I've mounted in DriveWire. Has anyone's head exploded yet? I know what I'm talking about because I did this. It makes sense to me. Hopefully I haven't lost you. In summary, this little program will boot up automatically, unmount all of my CoCoSDC drives, so I have no virtual drives associated to anything or reserved for anything, and then I mount just drive 0 to the contents of whatever I'm going to stick into DriveWire slot 0. So this is what the program looks like. This program is living on my CoCoSDC. One other thing I did to make launching my DriveWire just a little tiny bit easier is I went ahead and I created 2 little batch files to launch DriveWire. One of them I called DW1152, that's for the 115K for Coco 3. One of them is called DW384, that's for your 384K. And then I also, for grins and giggles, is I've added this line here to where when I click this batch file, which is now basically an icon, I can make a shortcut to this icon and just launch it from my desktop or whatever. The first thing I do in my batch file is I actually open up the browser to the user interface port of the PyDriveWire, and then I launch PyDriveWire based on the given speed. So when I launch my batch file, I am getting my web browser will open up, and here it is, and here's my DriveWire in the background. So now what I do in drive slot disk 0 is I hit choose file. In this case here, I'm going to go ahead and choose the most recently patched grabber disk that Curtis Boyle just finished patching for us. So now what does it look like here when I want to go ahead and reboot my Coco? This is what the program looked like that I ran. I'm going to power cycle my Coco. I'm going to turn my Coco back on, and then boom. What happens here is as soon as I turn it on, it has done a DriveWire mount, drive 0 on my Coco to slot 0 on DriveWire, and it went ahead and listed out the contents of that disk for me. And look how quickly that happened. A hell of a lot quicker than it took me to explain to you what the hell I just did. But as you can see here, you can boot up your Coco to a disk in DriveWire, and then boom, there it is. And then I can go ahead and do a load M of grabber, and then I can execute it. So my crazy harebrained idea was, hey man, since I just discovered this newfangled DriveWire thing that all the cool kids have been talking about, why don't I just start DriveWiring all the time for everything I do, just to start getting more familiar with it, right? The problem I ran into in trying to do that is there are a number of, especially games that I tried to boot up, that require access to the disk controller or disk IO or disk ROM routines or whatever the hell it is. But there are certain software programs that if they need to talk to the disk interface or something to that level, they don't work over DriveWire. And so I understand this would also be true for like copy protected games that have some type of weird disk mechanic to them. So DriveWire is great for loading stuff and not having to worry about navigating your SD card. However, not all programs are going to run well over DriveWire. As it turns out here, this one will. Grabber will work. And there you have it. It's pretty easy to use your CoCoSDC to auto boot to DriveWire. All right, so in the root of my SD card, I've got STARTUP.CFG. STARTUP.CFG simply says 0 equals AUTOEXEC.DSK. So my startup config file takes slot 0 of my CoCoSDC and mounts this AUTOEXEC.DSK file. What does this AUTOEXEC.DSK file have? It has this AUTOEXEC basic program. What does this AUTOEXEC basic program have? It has 4 commands that unmount all of the drives, and then it mounts drive 0 to DriveWire slot 0, which I have to pre-populate using my DriveWire interface here. So as long as I've got a disk mounted in my DriveWire server before I boot up my Coco, it will automatically boot. It will then list the contents of that directory for you. It will search for an AUTOEXEC.BAS file on that disk that you've mounted and booted to, and if it can, it will try to run that for you. And if not, you'll just see the directory listing and the program will end and you'll see your OK prompt. How long does that take? When I fire up my Coco, boom, 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 DriveWire mount, boom, there's my directory. Happens pretty quickly. So it's a cool little proof of concept. It's something I will do for like developing my own stuff most likely, and just playing around with things I can load over DriveWire just so I can DriveWire more often and become more familiar with some of the stuff it can do for us. So I invite you all to DriveWire, but DriveWire responsibly. OG Stevie Stroh, peace out.